In a quiet American town, 29-year-old Ethan Carter lived a life that many would call ordinary, but for him, it was a daily battle. His small auto shop sat on the edge of town, with peeling paint on the walls, and rust creeping over old signs that once looked proud. He often spent nights alone, under the dim light of a single bulb, repairing cars and trucks that brought in barely enough money to keep his garage open. Bills stacked up on his counter, rent was overdue, and many nights dinner was nothing more than stale bread and coffee. Despite the struggles, Ethan's hands were strong and skilled. He had inherited his love for fixing things from his late father, who had taught him that every machine has a soul, you just have to listen closely. Those words stayed with him. While others saw him as a poor mechanic who never caught a break, Ethan carried quiet pride in his work. Every dent he fixed, every engine he revived, was his way of keeping his father's memory alive. But no matter how hard he worked, life always seemed to push him 2 steps backward. One chilly afternoon, as Ethan was wiping grease off his hands, he noticed a luxury black SUV pulling up outside his shabby shop. The sight was unusual. People driving such expensive cars rarely stopped in his part of town. Curious, he stepped out, brushing dust off his overalls, and saw a driver carefully helping a young girl out of the back seat. She couldn't walk. Instead, she was placed gently into a broken wheelchair. The girl's face was pale, but her eyes held a kind of hope that seemed too heavy for someone her age. The girl, no older than 11, held the side of her wheelchair tightly. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her clothes, though fine, were overshadowed by the sadness in her expression. She looked directly at Ethan, her eyes brimming with tears, and said in a trembling voice, "Sir, can you fix my wheelchair? It broke down yesterday. I can't go outside anymore." Her words cut through the air like a quiet plea, one that Ethan couldn't ignore. His heart softened instantly. For a moment, Ethan stood still, caught off guard by the request. He had repaired engines, transmissions, and even old tractors, but never had a child rolled up to him with something so personal and vital. He bent down, meeting her gaze so she wouldn't feel small, and said gently, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll fix it for you." The girl's lips curled into the faintest smile, as if his words alone gave her some comfort. The driver stepped aside, relieved, and Ethan carefully wheeled the chair into his shop. Inside, the garage smelled of oil, rubber, and worn-out steel. Ethan placed the wheelchair on a workbench, inspecting its damage. The brakes were jammed. One wheel was nearly detached, and the seat frame was loose. Clearly, it had taken a lot of wear, and replacing parts wouldn't be easy without proper tools. But Ethan was determined. He glanced at the girl, who sat quietly near the entrance, watching him with wide eyes filled with anticipation. He gave her a reassuring nod before rolling up his sleeves. Hours passed as Ethan worked with steady hands. He disassembled the damaged wheels, cleaned every part, and scavenged spare bolts and bearings from old boxes he had lying around. When he couldn't find replacements, he improvised, reshaping metal parts with his hammer and filing down rough edges until they fit perfectly. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he didn't stop. The thought of Emma he had heard the driver call her that stuck in his mind. She wasn't just asking for a repair, she was asking for freedom, for a chance to move, to feel like any other child again. Every so often, Ethan glanced at Emma, and each time he saw her hopeful face, he felt a strange warmth. She reminded him of his little sister, who had passed away years ago from illness. He remembered how helpless he had felt then, unable to do anything to ease her pain. This time, with Emma, he had a chance to make a difference. He worked harder, almost as if fixing the wheelchair was a way of healing his own old wound. His heart guided his hands more than his mind did. By late evening, the chair began to take shape again. Ethan had replaced the broken wheel with a reinforced one, fixed the brake system, tightened the frame, and even polished the handles to make it look less worn. When he stepped back to see the result, the chair looked sturdy, almost brand new. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He hadn't made a dime out of this, but he felt richer than he had in months. Sometimes true payment came in forms that money could never match. "All right, Emma," Ethan said softly, wheeling the chair toward her. "Give it a try." The girl's eyes widened as she touched the newly restored handles. With the driver's help, she sat in the chair, hesitantly placing her hands on the wheels. Slowly, she pushed forward, and to her amazement, the chair glided smoothly across the shop floor. She turned in circles, laughing a laugh so pure and full of joy that it filled every dusty corner of the garage. Ethan stood silently, watching her with a lump in his throat. Emma's laughter was contagious. The driver smiled too, clearly touched, and even Ethan felt his tired body fill with energy. For a few moments, the hardships of his life, his unpaid bills, his empty fridge, his lonely nights faded away. All that mattered was that a little girl had her smile back. When Emma stopped, she looked up at him, her cheeks glowing, and whispered, "Thank you. You fixed more than my chair. You fixed my heart." Ethan froze at her words, his eyes stinging with unspoken emotion. He crouched beside her, patting the side of the chair gently. "No, Emma, you did that yourself. I just fixed a machine. You brought back the light." The girl hugged him suddenly, her small arms wrapping around his grease-stained shoulders. For Ethan, it was the warmest embrace he had felt in years. He had no idea who she truly was, or that her mother was someone powerful. To him, Emma was just a child who deserved happiness, and that was enough. When the SUV pulled away, carrying Emma back home, Ethan stood at the garage door long after they had gone. The evening air was cold, but he felt an unusual warmth in his chest. For once, his small world didn't. "I feel so empty." He didn't know it yet, but this single act of kindness would set in motion events that would soon change his life forever. He closed the shop for the night, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude, unaware that tomorrow would bring the most unexpected visitor of all. The next morning, Ethan Carter opened the garage early, as he always did, the cold air biting at his hands as he swept the dust and scraps from the concrete floor. The shop smelled faintly of oil and metal, the scent that clung to his life like a second skin. His mind kept drifting back to Emma, the little girl with the fragile smile who had left the day before in her fixed wheelchair. He wondered if she was outside now, rolling through her yard, or maybe just sitting happily, feeling free again. That thought alone gave him comfort as he worked. The sound of an approaching engine pulled him out of his thoughts. Ethan looked up and his eyes widened. A long, sleek black limousine slowed to a stop in front of his small garage. The contrast was almost surreal. The gleaming luxury car parked against the backdrop of peeling paint, cracked windows, and Ethan's old Carter's Auto sign that barely hung straight anymore. His heart quickened. Limousines didn't belong on this street, and certainly not in front of his struggling shop. He wiped his hands nervously on a rag, unsure of what to expect. The back door opened, and out stepped a woman unlike anyone Ethan had ever met in person. She was tall, graceful, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that only came from years of power and influence. Her designer coat, tailored perfectly, brushed against the car as she stepped forward. Expensive heels clicked against the pavement, yet her face told a different story. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were softened by something tender, something almost vulnerable. Ethan stood frozen as she walked closer, her gaze fixed on him with a strange intensity. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke. "Are you the man who repaired my daughter's wheelchair?" Ethan blinked, surprised not only by her question, but by the raw emotion that laced every word. He swallowed, suddenly aware of the grease stains on his shirt and the worn-out look of his shop. Clearing his throat, he nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "She seemed so happy I just wanted to help." He had no idea who this woman was. Not yet, but the weight of her presence made him stand a little straighter. The woman's eyes glistened, tears welling as she stepped closer. Her elegant appearance didn't match the way her voice cracked with emotion. "You don't know what you've done," she whispered. "My daughter Emma hasn't smiled like that in months. Doctors, nurses, even the most expensive specialists in the country couldn't reach her heart the way you did. But you gave her back her freedom." For a moment her words seemed to hang in the air, filling the silence of the empty street. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He had fixed a chair, but for her it was much more. Ethan scratched the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. "Ma'am, I just repaired what was broken. That's all I know how to do." His tone was humble, but inside he felt a storm of emotions. He never imagined something so simple could matter so much. All his life he had been told that money, status, and connections were what brought real change. Yet here stood a woman, dressed in wealth and power, crying because of a simple act of kindness from a poor mechanic. It shook him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It was then that Ethan recognized her. The features he had seen countless times on news reports and magazine covers suddenly clicked into place. Victoria Hamilton, one of the wealthiest and most powerful businesswomen in America, a billionaire known for her empire of companies that stretched across industries. But standing before him now, she wasn't the image of power and prestige. She was just a mother, trembling as she thought about the happiness of her little girl. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He had never spoken to someone like her in his entire life. Victoria took another step closer, lowering her voice as though afraid of breaking the fragile moment. "When Emma came home yesterday, she wouldn't stop talking about you. She said you treated her like she mattered, like she wasn't a burden. Do you have any idea how much that means to a mother?" Her tears finally spilled, running down her cheeks, though she quickly brushed them away. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He wasn't used to seeing raw emotion like this, especially not from someone of her stature. It humbled him even more. For a few moments, Ethan could only stare at the ground, struggling with the weight of her words. He thought about his own mother, who had raised him with nothing but love and sacrifice until the day she passed away. He thought about his little sister, whose illness had left scars on his heart that never fully healed. Maybe, without realizing it, helping Emma had been his way of making peace with all the loss in his past. He looked up finally, his voice steady though quiet. "Mom, Emma reminded me of someone I once loved. Fixing her chair was the least I could do." Victoria's expression softened even more at his honesty. She had met countless people in her life, business partners, investors, politicians, but very few who spoke with such sincerity. Money often corrupted words, twisting them into flattery or deceit. But here was a man who meant what he said, without expecting anything in return. She placed a hand over her chest, as if steadying her heartbeat, then whispered, "The world doesn't have enough people like you, Mr. Carter. You've done something no fortune could ever buy." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise, but something inside him swelled with quiet pride. The limousine driver remained respectfully in the background, watching silently as the two spoke. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Ethan, in his grease-stained clothes and worn boots, standing in front of his crumbling garage, and Victoria in her flawless attire with every sign of wealth and influence surrounding her. And yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. There were no classes, no differences, just a man who had shown kindness and a mother who was grateful beyond measure. The divide between their worlds seemed to fade in the light of shared humanity. Victoria wiped her eyes quickly, regaining a bit of composure, though her voice remained soft. "Ethan, may I call you that?" He nodded silently. "You may not realize it, but yesterday you gave my daughter something priceless. You gave her joy, and you gave me hope." Her words struck him deeply, almost overwhelming him. He wasn't used to people looking at him like that, with respect, with gratitude. Most days, customers barely thanked him, often haggling to pay less. Now here was one of the richest women in the country, thanking him like he had saved her world. Ethan didn't know what to say. He looked around his shop, the broken tools, the flickering light bulb above him, the shelves lined with parts he could barely afford to replace. He felt small compared to the empire this woman represented, yet for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He realized that sometimes the smallest acts could echo the loudest. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "I'm just glad she's happy, that's all that matters." And he meant it. Every word came from the deepest part of his being. Victoria studied him closely, as if trying to memorize the man who had changed her daughter's world. In her life, she had built skyscrapers, bought companies, and controlled industries, but none of those achievements compared to seeing her child laugh freely again. She had met people who chased her wealth, people who used her status, but this man had asked for nothing. He had simply given. That kind of heart was rare, so rare, she thought. It deserved something in return. Her mind was already working, forming an idea that would soon alter Ethan's life forever. Ethan, however, remained unaware of what was to come. For him, this was just another morning, one that had turned unexpectedly emotional. He couldn't have guessed that. His quiet act of compassion would reach so far beyond his little garage. As Victoria stepped back toward her limousine, she paused, looking at him one last time with a smile that carried both gratitude and promise. Ethan stood rooted to the ground, his heart racing. Something told him that this was only the beginning, that yesterday's kindness had opened a door to a future he never imagined. The following day, Ethan Carter found himself standing before towering iron gates that opened slowly to reveal a long driveway lined with perfectly trimmed trees. At the end of the path stood a mansion so magnificent it seemed to belong in another world entirely. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, his nerves rattling. Marble columns stretched skyward, glass windows reflected the morning sun, and fountains sparkled in the vast courtyard. He had never been near such wealth before, and his modest clothes made him feel even more out of place. As he pulled up and parked, the front doors of the mansion swung open, and a small figure rushed out before he could even climb out of his truck. Emma's laughter rang through the air as she sped across the stone walkway in her newly repaired wheelchair. "My hero is here!" she shouted with pure joy. Ethan's heart softened. Instantly, he barely noticed the grandeur around him as the little girl flung her arms around him. He knelt down to hug her back, his rough hands holding her gently, his chest tight with emotion. Inside, the mansion gleamed with chandeliers that glittered like stars, polished marble floors that echoed every step, and hallways lined with paintings and statues. Ethan followed Victoria and Emma, feeling more like a visitor in a museum than a guest in a home. Every detail screamed of wealth, yet he couldn't shake the warmth in Emma's smile or the gratitude in Victoria's eyes. The contrast was overwhelming. He, a poor mechanic who struggled to buy groceries, now standing inside a palace built on power and fortune. Victoria guided him into a grand living room where floor-to-ceiling windows let in beams of sunlight. She gestured for him to sit, her poise still elegant, but her tone filled with sincerity. "Ethan," she began softly, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, "you've given my daughter something priceless. You gave her a smile I thought I'd never see again. You gave her hope when I had nearly lost mine." Her eyes shone with tears, though her voice was steady. Ethan sat silently, unsure how to respond, humbled by her words. He shifted uncomfortably in the luxurious armchair, glancing around at the golden frames and velvet curtains. "Ma'am, I only fixed what was broken," he muttered, feeling almost embarrassed by her praise. "I didn't do anything special." But Victoria shook her head firmly, her eyes locking on his with an intensity that silenced him. "No, Ethan, you didn't just fix a chair. You reminded my daughter that she matters. You gave her freedom, and that's something even the best doctors couldn't do." Ethan felt the weight of her words sink deep into his soul. Victoria took a breath, gathering herself before continuing. That's why I want to give you something too. I'm opening a mobility and auto repair division for my company, a place where people like Emma, children, veterans, anyone struggling can find solutions. I want you to run it. Her words seemed to hang in the air like a dream too impossible to believe. Ethan's jaw dropped, his heart pounding in disbelief. He stared at her, trying to process what she had just offered. Him? Running part of a billionaire's company? The thought was almost too much. His voice trembled as he finally managed to speak. Ma'am, I don't know if I'm the right person for something like that. I'm just a mechanic. I don't know anything about running divisions or companies. But Victoria smiled gently, her confidence unwavering. Ethan, I don't need someone with a fancy degree or polished words. I need someone with heart. You see problems and you fix them, not just machines, but lives. That's what this division needs, and that's why you're the only man I trust to lead it. Her words wrapped around him like a promise. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he thought about his years of struggle, fixing cars in a shop that barely stayed open, counting every dollar to pay rent, skipping meals to stretch his savings. For so long, survival was his only goal. Yet here he was, being offered a chance at a future he had never dared to dream. His throat tightened, and his voice cracked as he whispered, I don't know what to say. Emma, still clinging to his arm, looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Say yes, Ethan, please. He glanced down at her, the little girl who had unknowingly changed his life. Her smile was so full of trust, so full of belief in him that he couldn't hold back his emotions. He brushed a tear from his cheek and nodded slowly. All right, yes, I'll do it. Emma squealed with delight, wrapping her arms around him tightly. Victoria's face softened with relief and joy. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. It was as if all his sacrifices had finally found meaning. That night, as Ethan drove his old truck back home, the world looked different. The streets of his small town no longer felt like the end of his road, but the beginning of something greater. He thought about his late mother, how proud she would have been to see this moment. He thought about all the people who had once overlooked him, who had seen only a poor mechanic. And he thought about Emma's laughter, the sound that had started it all. His chest swelled with gratitude, his eyes misting as he whispered into the night, Thank you. Over the following weeks, Ethan's life transformed in ways he never imagined. Victoria introduced him to her company's board, not as a mechanic, but as the head of a new vision, a division dedicated to mobility and innovation. Engineers and designers shook his hand with respect, listening as he shared ideas rooted in compassion and practicality. For the first time, people valued his voice, his perspective. Every day felt surreal, but Ethan carried himself with the same humility he always had, never forgetting where he came from or the girl who had changed his path. Emma became a frequent visitor to his new workshop, her laughter echoing through the halls as she watched him and his team build new designs. You didn't just fix my wheelchair, she told him one afternoon, hugging him tightly. You fixed my life. Those words stayed with Ethan, echoing in his heart each time he faced challenges, because he knew this wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about giving people dignity, giving them hope, giving them freedom. Every bolt tightened, every frame adjusted was more than work, it was a promise to someone's future. From that day on, Ethan Carter's world was never the same. No longer was he just a poor mechanic struggling to survive. He was a man whose kindness had turned into a miracle. His story spread quietly, not through headlines or fame, but through the lives he touched. Children who rolled freely again, veterans who stood tall with new strength, families who cried tears of gratitude, and in the center of it all was Ethan, a humble man who proved that sometimes the smallest act of compassion could change everything, even the course of a billionaire's world.